Thank you. Half a day. The Committee on General Government Operation, Appropriation, and Housing is now called to order. Today is Friday, May 29th, and the time is 4 o'clock p.m. Notice for this public hearing were disseminated via email to all senators and all main media broadcasting outlets. And that was on Thursday, May 21st, and on Wednesday, May 27th. Welcome to everyone connected by Zoom and those tuning in via television or the YouTube channel. Thank you for your patience and accommodating the Zoom platform while we maintain healthy emergency physical distancing mandates. The agenda will be discussing Bill 359-35 COR, sponsored by Speaker Tina Rose Munoz Barnes, co-sponsored by Senator Jose Pito Terlai, Senator Clint Rigel, Senator Mary Camacho Torres, and Senator William Castro. An act to establish additional annual leave compensation for Guam's COVID-19 heroes. I'd like to acknowledge my colleagues that have joined us this afternoon. I will begin with Madam Speaker Tina Munoz Barnes. We have Madam Senator Vice Speaker Senator Talina Nelson. We have in our audience, we have Senator Therese Terlai. We have Assistant Majority Leader Senator Kelly Mars Taitano. We have Senator Minority Leader Senator Tello Taitagui. We have Senator Assistant Minority Whip Senator William James Moylan, and we're also joined by Senator William Castro and Senator Mary Camacho Torres. Ma'am, we're also joined today. My colleagues to be testifying is Mr. Ken Youngero. He's joined us this afternoon. This Zoom meeting is hosted by our staff, and we'll mute all Zoom participants until called upon by myself. So I'd ask you all, just go ahead and unmute your computer so we can mute you, and then we'll be able to turn you on. Otherwise, we'll be both chasing after the mute button. Okay? Stand by. You muted everybody? Okay. The members of the committee and or the legislature wishing to speak may indicate their desire to me through the in-app chat feature. Individuals testifying shall first be recognized by myself before speaking and begin by stating their name for record-keeping purposes. When called to speak, please ensure that you are unmuted. Committee members will be allowed to pose a question to an individual testifying for a round, and will be provided another round if needed at my discretion. We might move to the next item on the agenda, which is not until 6 o'clock, so we won't have to worry about that. Question and testimony shall be confined to the substance or the nature of the agenda. My colleagues and Mr. Youngren and anybody else that joins us, we'll be speaking about Bill 359-35, and that's the only thing we're going to be talking about. Personal inference as to the character or the motive of any senator or any individual testifying is not permitted. Any violation of this general rule of conduct will result in removal from the public hearing by the host. So let's just keep this clean, folks. Please ensure that your video remains on throughout the hearing. Participant must be visible at all times and not engage in other activity during the hearing. You can have a drink, a snack if you want, but as long as you're visible, it'll be okay. Failure to maintain visibility may cause your removal from the meeting from meeting live stream. I'd like to first invite Speaker Tina Munoz Barnes to provide a synopsis on our bill. Madam Speaker Tina Munoz Barnes. Ma'am.
Hi, Mr. Chair, can you hear me now? Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair, for giving me the opportunity to speak on this bill. Bill 359-35 COR is introduced by myself, Tina Rose Munoz Barnes, Senator Pito Terlahi, Senator Clinton Rigel, Senator Mary Camacho Torres, and Senator William Castro. It's an act to establish additional annual leave compensation for Guam's COVID-19 heroes. Mr. Chair, the intent of this proposed legislation is to compensate or pay classified employees of the government of Guam during the COVID-19 public health emergency by granting 1 hour of annual leave for every hour worked from the inception of PCOR 1, which was effective March 20th, 2020 through May 10th, 2020. And employees on this legislation, Mr. Chair, must have physically reported to work during the stated emergency period and did not receive any additional compensation, administrative leave, or compensatory time off aside from what was provided for in the governor's executive order of 2020-08. The legislation also states that no employee shall receive more than 240 hours of annual leave. Further, this section authorizes a lump sum payment of up to 120 hours at the request of the employer prior to October 1st, 2020. And I want to note, Mr. Chair, that the BBMR's fiscal note, policy note, says that and based on the introduction, this was as a solution to double pay for employees during this emergency. And per the correspondence with DOA, the estimated costs of this double pay for the executive branch line agencies amounts to about, I want to say, it was $3 million per pay period, and there's 80 hours in a pay period. And although not directly related to double pay, a lump sum payment of leave accrued on a 1 hour for the basis of work conducted during the pandemic translates to that similar form of payment out. And I want to say that combining the efforts of what was noted with DOA to the costs per pay period with the maximum amount of leave that was requested, that lump sum at working it at a 50% upfront, they were sharing that cost would be about 4.5 million. And I just want to say that that based on this, Mr. Chair, I want to note the impetus of this proposed legislation was a few weeks ago. I joined our frontliners in their quest for seeking what they believe is their rightful compensation. And I heard firsthand of the sacrifices of many of them that they had made, and sharing with me that some of them hadn't even seen their spouses or kids for a period of like 6 weeks. And in an effort to keep their loved ones safe, I heard the stories of how they had to foot the bill for alternate accommodations as well. And looking at the original projections that were presented and looking at the reality today, I want to say our frontliners and our community as a whole, everyone stepped up to literally take the time to care for our sinus, and I want to be the first to say that I want to extend my thank yous to all of them, to all of you who really have taken the time to be a part of at least protecting who we are and just our community as a whole. And I wanted to make this disparity for those who sacrificed, right? And I looked at the CARES Act, Mr. Chair, and I wanted to see how we could do this. And I saw that in the guidance, given that this may be construed as a bonus and not be eligible under the workforce bonuses other than hazard pay or overtime, provisions under the ineligible examples listed by the Treasury. These hours had been worked already, and paying them now may be construed as a bonus. And I didn't want to have the government of Guam look at having to have this paid back by the government. So in our efforts of working together in bipartisan support, I know that many of my colleagues have debated whether or not this bill will qualify for the CARES Act, and some of whom have self-certified themselves as legal experts have said that you know, they have their opinions about this. I want to say that our team has been working many hours with the White House and Treasury to get clarification. I've shared to a lot of you, or almost all of you, that I wrote to our contacts at both the White House and the Treasury and shared with them the bills that were before us and what has been proposed on May 19th. And since there have been countless phone calls, Mr. Chair, I wanted to see if I could get a better understanding, if they could give us a better understanding based on the situation that was here on Guam. And I want to share with my colleagues today that on May 27th, Mr. Daniel Kowalski, who currently serves as the counselor, the legal counsel to the Secretary of the Treasury, they had informed us that the Treasury stance on this matter is that any change to the law and compensation after hours that are worked is considered a bonus. And I want to also share that Mr. Kowalski's findings be shared with me in writing. And I was informed on the next day, which was Thursday, today's the May 28th, that given the importance of these clarified guidances to our legislature, they will be entertaining these measures next week. And U.S. Because we're entertaining the bills possibly next week, that the U.S. Treasury will be including a guidance to the inquiry and share their perspective, and that they wanted to tell us that they will have that in writing by early next week. I was hoping that I would get it today, but the call this morning that was shared with me was it would be in writing. I would say at least Monday afternoon our time. And once we have it in writing that the CARES Act fund will not be able to be used for any of these measures, putting our differences aside, Mr. Chair, I want to say that I want to continue to work closely with the administration and, of course, our colleagues to find the funds to do right by our frontliners. And I hoping that with the bills that are before us, that we can hopefully look at another bill that's already on the agenda. And I know we're not supposed to be talking about that, but there's a bill which would provide needed funding to do right by these COVID heroes and also pay tax refunds. So while that bill would solve the fiscal portion of this main proposed legislation creates the mechanism to get it done. And before I close, Mr. Chair, I just want to reiterate one more time that on behalf of the bipartisan support of the legislature, and I just want to say thank you to all the frontliners, the nurses, the firemen, the police officers, correction officers, public health employees, civil defense, the DO employees, and many countless other COVID workers. Thank you for their sacrifice and in our efforts to truly try and see what they can to get what's rightfully due to them. This is an effort that I've put forward, and I know that there is debate on both sides, and I'm just hoping that with all our efforts stepping up to the plate, that we can look at coming up with a amicable resolve, working with the information that's provided to us. and that we can do something for all our frontliners. So thank you, Mr. Chair, for giving me that opportunity and some time to at least share my perspective of why I had proffered this amendment based on hearing a lot of the frontliners' concerns. Sinamasi.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I'd like to also recognize my colleagues that have joined us. We have the Assistant Minority Leader, Luis Munia. Thank you, ma'am, for joining us. We have also Legislative Secretary Majority Whip Amanda Shelton. Thank you for joining us. And we have also Senator Peter Terlai. Thank you, Peter. Before we begin any questions to the author, I'd like to recognize Mr. Ken Youngero, the spokesman for Citizen for Public Accountability. He will be presenting his testimony, and then we can proceed with our colleagues. Because I don't see anybody else that I don't have anybody else that is signed in to give any testimony. Mr. Youngero, sir.
Okay. For the record, my name is Ken Leon Guerrero. I'm the spokesman for Guam Citizens for Public Accountability. The comments I'm making today apply to all of the bills that are under consideration by this committee on this day. To begin with, this is a very divisive subject. You know, we are talking about an island that is in trouble. And as a result of the island, the way these bills and the language in these bills and the rhetoric around these bills, you know, you're dividing the people into two categories, heroes and non-heroes. The way this testimony bill, everybody who does their job, the job they were hired to do and the job they perform, they're being paid to perform, is considered a hero. What about the 30 to 40,000 people who lost their jobs, who stayed at home, who did their best efforts to prevent the spread? They self-quarantined. Whenever they went out, they minimized trips, they wore masks, they used hand sanitizers. You know, they are heroes too, because it is because of the behavior of the people following the guidelines, which was it was even more important in stopping the escalation in numbers that were forecast. It wasn't the frontline troops, it was everybody that did it. But now we have divided the people into two groups. One group is the heroes. The other group is the victims. Is that what we are? Because we stayed at home, we didn't have jobs, we didn't have paychecks, we ran out of food, we ran out of supplies because aid was late in getting to the people. But now we're taking people who are on the front line, and I would change that to the definition to they were in dancing distance with risk. It wasn't that they were heroes. They were doing the jobs they were hired to do. Now they're taking more risk than they hired on for. That needs to be acknowledged. But does it need to be acknowledged to the point where we are dividing even government employees into two groups? Government employees are going to be treated better than other government employees. The way this whole thing is looking to the people is this is the typical pandering we see coming up on an election, like the 2014 pay raises that were approved just weeks before the August primary. You know, this whole media spin about recognizing the heroes. Everyone in this situation is a hero. The people that were on the front lines, but the people behind the front lines that did work that was as hard, if not harder. Where is the recognition and compensation for them? The people on the front lines got a paycheck every 2 weeks, like clockwork. The people behind the front lines got nothing. And a lot of them still haven't gotten anything if you listen to talk radio. I mean, it's just now gotten to the point where I think today the administration announced they finally got the last of the stimulus checks out. So for nearly 3 months, the people behind the front line, the ones that are doing the hardest work, are getting the least amount of recognition. And the end result of the bills that you're proposing here is going to divert government funds away from badly needed services and badly needed support to help make the rest of the community whole. Because now we're talking about the fact that these pay increases and bonuses and things might not be covered by the CARES Act. Well, where's that money going to come from? We're going to take it out of public safety, public health, and education. And who does that affect? Does it affect the front line, or does it affect those behind the front line the most? It's going to affect those behind the front line the most. Going into this year, I remember listening to a special economic session where we were talking about the fact that all the special funds except for one were not meeting projections. I think the one was the tobacco tax, if I'm not mistaken. So we know that government of Guam revenues are going to get hammered. We shut down the economy for 3 months. We didn't collect payroll taxes from a substantial part of our population. We didn't collect a large amount of gross receipt taxes. And all those are going to have an impact on the revenue. Now, if we're going to take money out of the general fund to fund these raises and fund them to the extent, I mean, one of the bills is including directors, deputy directors, and excluded people. We're taking the whole 19th floor of Pacific Stargate, and we're going to give them double pay, is the way some of these bills read. And when you take all the bills, the double pay bills and the leave bills, some of those people are going to get bonus checks in the neighborhood of $50,000. And that's going to be $50,000 that's either coming out of the CARES money that is supposed to be used to help the people of Guam, or it's going to come out of government of Guam. In either case, the people of Guam are the ones who are going to suffer, regardless which version of these bills pass. I agree that those that were in dancing distance of those that were infected with COVID or potentially affected with COVID should receive some additional compensation, because when you join to be a policeman, they tell you, and as part of your job, you may be killed. You accept that. But this was different. This is what we would call in the military hazardous duty pay, because now we're saying, okay, as part of doing your job, there's a risk you may get infected and infect your family. Okay, that's above and beyond the call of duty. And I agree that some form of differential comparable to what the military offers is combat pay. But I don't believe the military doubles salaries in a combat zone. I believe they give an increase and make it tax deductible. But since the 30th, 31st, 32nd, 33rd, 34th legislatures refused to look at delinking, you guys don't have the ability to make this tax deductible at this time. But what you can do is bring rationality to this. You can recognize that the entire population of Guam was affected by this. Frontliners, they did Herculean work. But those behind the front line worked as hard, and that's why we are seeing numbers as low as we are. Look at what's happening in Wisconsin, South Dakota, Georgia, and Texas as the people are starting to mingle freely, and we're seeing their numbers spike up. Where are we here on Guam? Over the last couple of weeks, we've had, 2 or 3 cases diagnosed? So it shows that the people of Guam are doing the hard work. And as you contemplate these bills, you need to stop separating government and Guam employee from government and Guam employee, and government and Guam employees a group away from the public, because we all suffered. We all took risk. The ones on the front may have taken risks that they might be exposed to a disease that so far has less than 1% fatality ratio here on Guam. But those behind the front line, they're risking mortgages. They're risking starvation as they run out of food. They're risking having their financial situation destroyed. They're risking having cars repossessed. They're risking evictions, because as much as the governor wants to, I don't think she can put off evictions forever. And I know many landlords who are hurting now because they were so leveraged that missing 2 or 3 rent payments is putting them in jeopardy of having some bank in New York repossess their properties. And as much as the governor thinks she's got power, I don't think she can tell a bank in New York, that they can't repossess a house on Guam. So as in summary, everybody suffered. Nobody suffered more than anybody else. One group of people, and only one group of people, took extraordinary risk above and beyond the call of duty. That was doctors, nurses, ambulance drivers, police, and fire. But the accountants working in DOA, why are they even? I mean, you all heard Lieben's ruling that the frontliners may not get paid double pay, but the accountants who cut the checks for them will. These are the types of things that you need to be addressing to make sure that it's an equal and level playing field, recognizing the contributions of everyone. That's what the CARES Act is. A big part of that is to make the people whole, but we can't keep diverting money out of it to make one group more whole than the other. So, yes, the frontline people took risks, but they didn't take any more risks than those who stayed home, isolated, didn't go out, ran out of food, and ran out of money. I mean, it was a burden that was shared by everyone. So as you go forward, keep that in mind, because the way these bills look right now, it's political pandering to the largest voting bloc on Guam, which is government employees. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Dongaro, Ken. We will begin with Madam Speaker Tina Munoz Barnes. Do you have any questions with Mr. Dongaro, ma'am?
Not at this time, Mr. Chair. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Madam Vice Speaker, do you have any questions at this time? Oh, there you go. There you go. Now you're good. Thank you.
Sorry, thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd like to thank you, Ken, for coming forward and giving testimony. You always provide a different perspective on things, and I appreciate that. I do have a question for the sponsor of the bill, Mr. Chair, and that would just to clarify. You mentioned that U.S. Department of Treasury spoke about modifying the law, that it would be considered as a bonus pay, or so. Can you just re-clarify what your conversation with Department of Treasury was?
How do you get me in?
You're in already, Madam Speaker. We're unmuting everybody as we go along. There you go.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So the question again, one more time, Vice Speaker, was if the Treasury's advice to us was is it considered a bonus pay? If it's not in the law, Madam Vice, when they worked, then it's considered a bonus pay.
So,
paying them retroactively, Madam Vice Speaker.
In the CARES Act appropriation, we saw that $20 million went to GITA to assist in small businesses. Has there been any discussion about utilizing that same kind of mechanism or a similar mechanism so that we can target those private businesses that had employees working during PCOR 1 to give them compensation?
Vice Speaker, that's a very good question. I think that inquiry just came in recently too, and I think that we should extend a request to GITA to see if that could be doable for this, and in our efforts to trying to help our frontliners, not just within the government, but everyone in general. I think that's something that we can literally consider. So yeah, thank you very much, Vice Speaker. And if there's anything that our staff can work together to expedite that, I'm here. Yes, definitely.
Yeah, Speaker, because originally when we pushed this hazardous pay bill out and somehow it evolved to a double pay in accordance with the 8.406,
Yeah.
we included private employees, that the government would pay for the private employees that worked in the grocery stores, that worked at the gas stations, right? And so one of our colleagues, I won't mention any names, removed that amendment. And so if there's a way that we can find a way with your Department of Treasury POC, if we
Yes.
can create that mechanism too, that I think that would be a good way forward. Thank
Thank
you.
you. Mr. Chair, I want to say thank you to the Vice Speaker for those efforts, at least in seeing how we can get step out of the box and get creative and see what we can ask. The worst thing can happen is that they won't allow us to do that. The best thing that can happen is that, again, we look into getting something for our people, and definitely would be something that we would consider moving forward immediately. Thank
Okay.
you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Madam Vice, you still have the floor, ma'am.
Just one more thing. We're going to be receiving a copy from the Department of Treasury's statement on the specifics of the CARES Act. Right, Speaker? Is that what was said earlier?
Sorry. If the information that was provided to me was that they would provide the information to me early next week. So early next week to me is Monday, Tuesday, Sunday, Monday. So
Okay.
hope I get it.
Thank you, Speaker. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Ken.
Thank you, Ken.
Thank you, Madam Vice, Madam Speaker. Senator Amanda Shelton, Legislative Secretary, ma'am. Do you have any questions?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I don't have any questions at this time. I appreciate the testimony. Thank you, Mr. Leon Guerrero.
Okay, moving along, Senator Kelly March Titano, ma'am. Unmute.
Susan Mossy, Mr. Chair. And as I've been saying throughout the day, this has been an important day. It makes it a bit of a marathon to go through all of these bills, but it's well worth it to make sure that we're having the time to hear from our different colleagues, be able to ask the questions, or at least get them ready to send to ask to others that have been crossing our minds since the beginning. You know, as I've mentioned, this is complex. There are a lot of issues to it. And so we need to be as thoughtful as possible. What we've been hearing since the beginning, and it was the impetus for all of these bills that are trying to address the inequities that we're hearing about, the uncertainties that we're hearing about, the disparities that people are expressing, and us dealing with a situation that the laws perhaps hadn't taken into consideration. Being a pandemic, it's something different than a typhoon and the other types of disasters or state of emergencies that we're dealing with. And so one of my biggest hopes is that we come out with something that's more structured. It makes more sense, understanding that this is very likely going to be part of our landscape going forward, that we are going to have things like pandemics from time to time going forward that are just as, if not more, impactful. I mean, we have dealt with SARS and some of the others, but they were never quite this. And so it is a time to sit down, listen, and really think through as much as possible, to get legal advice, definitely, to understand that while we're tackling this, maybe we'll tackle some of it for the immediate, but we do have to sit down and think about how to tackle it for the future, so that the next time around, hopefully it doesn't happen, but scientists say that it will, that it's very likely to, that the next time around, we understand the landscape going in, that we've prepared for it, and we've tried to tailor the laws so that they will address all of these uncertainties that have been going on for these last 6 or 8, well, actually it's been 8 or more weeks now at this point. And so some of what I had mentioned before is that it is so valuable to hear all of the different perspectives and all of the different gaps that have been cropping up, and these different considerations from the community and from the different members who are part of the front line as it's currently defined, or in other realms of our community. And one of them that has been talked about all day, and I think it's a really valuable one, and one that we've talked about here, is it's a community concern. And certainly we're all affected by it in different ways and to different degrees. And so that has to be part of what we're figuring out. There's an employer aspect, but there's the larger community aspect as well. It's about being responsible, so figuring out what that really means in this situation. How are we best responsible in this situation? And that responsibility, it's about taking care of, or at least taking into consideration, those that have put their lives at risk. And, you know, I was re-looking up some of the definitions for hazard duty pay and hazardous pay, and it's saying compensating an employee for duty that could result in serious injury or death. And, you know, again, that does have to be part of our consideration. Now, this situation, as we've been learning, we're at risk in a lot more ways perhaps than typical. When it's a fire, we understand the risk. It's the firefighters that are out there fighting it. But in this case, there are all kinds of ways we've been at risk. Certainly, there are some that we really understand. The medical community, first and foremost, they're guaranteed that they're at risk. They're the closest, and they're the closest to people that we know definitely are infected with the disease. So this needs to be what we continue to weigh out for now, and like I said, in the long term. And then part of that responsibility also is that fiscal responsibility. It has to make sense in balance with our moral obligations as employers and as community representatives, but it also has to make sense from how we're behaving now and into the future with the dollars that we have. So yeah, it's again one of these situations where I really do appreciate everybody's input, the testimony we heard, the 8 or more testimonies that were written. Some of them are new for this particular bill that we've gotten to see. And all of them need to be an important part of helping us all figure out how to navigate these complexities that are with us. So thank you for allowing me to make those comments, Mr. Chair. And then I perhaps will be sending some questions to some of the different agencies and entities so that we can get further answers and further guidance.
Thank you, Senator Kelly. Senator Therese Terlai, ma'am, do you have any questions or any statement you want to pose to Mr. Longuero or the author of the bill? Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yeah, this bill is a little different than the other bills that we've talked about today. And although I think this bill still, we could use some discussion from DOA regarding the source of funding that's, I think, put in question now, right? So it's almost like when we talked about procurement and the source of funding for procurement determined whether it was legal or not. And now that looks like what's going to happen with these pay. If we use CARES money, this might be deemed a bonus and then not eligible to use CARES money. When we were discussing Bill 326 before it was vetoed, we were told, I thought, that by FEMA or by civil defense that if we wanted to get reimbursement from FEMA for the overtime pay, for the hazardous pay, for the COVID pay or whatever pay, double pay, that we had to be sure that we were paying according to a pre-existing law, which is sounding now similar to what the speaker says the Treasury is saying about CARES money. And so I would like that determination from DOA, you know, are they treating this as another type of hazardous pay? The word hazardous is not in this bill. It was in 326. And I think we were, you know, I would like to know if this, if these same people receive hazardous pay and overtime pay. And I think if they are receiving that, that might be reimbursable by FEMA. But if we're going to, of course, use CARES money, if we're not going to seek reimbursement by FEMA, then we only have two choices left. One is CARES money, and what we use CARES money for, you know, takes us away from using it for other things. But which would be okay, except if we can't use CARES money now, then we're left with the GovGuam fund, right, Mr. Chair? And I know that there was some talk during this hearing about replacing in the bill the source of funding, but I think that's where we really would need, you know, another public hearing with DOA to tell us about that source of funding. That's a whole different proposal. The other thing about this bill that's very different is this bill had put a cap on what we were going to give these employees. So they would be given leave, and then there would be a cap on it. So I thought at first that because there was, when the bill was announced, there was an agreement with the union and that it would forego any lawsuit. And I think as we've learned that now that we're facing a lawsuit, we're in the middle of it, in fact, and that we are promised another one by the union that almost the, you know, the trade-off for the employees of putting a cap, it's confusing at the least, I would say. You know, I guess I'm trying to figure out. I thought we were trying to promise that, you know, you're going to get this because the option is a lawsuit. But now we're getting on all fronts controversy, Mr. Chair. The fiscal note says $4.5 million is the impact of this bill. And so it's much less than any of the other bills we're talking about. However, in the governor, I thought in one of her press conferences, she announced that the impact of this would be $15 million. So I would like to question BBMR regarding their estimates. And I'm not sure whether this bill, is it intended to be also to take care of retroactive, because it doesn't seem to do that part either, which is, you know, one of the specific requests that the governor had asked of us, but I don't see that in the bill. But is that your understanding, Mr. Chair, or the sponsor, about whether retroactive is also included? But Mr. Chair, yeah, I'm very concerned because, yeah, we're trying to balance community, you know, with employees, with working employees, frontline employees versus employees working from home, or employees not really put at risk. And that was always seemingly unfair, of course. But, you know, we really need a very clear picture of what they have been compensated with. You know, have they received the hazardous pay that's in the law already? Have some of them received the double pay like we're told? Because Mr. Byrne wrote me a letter. I asked him after, you know, I got the AG's opinion. I wanted him to clarify that statement in the AG's opinion about that he's not found any records where double pay was ever made. And so he's sticking to that, Mr. Chair. That's my interpretation from his letter to me, but it doesn't seem right, because I could swear that the FEMA or the Civil Defense was telling us that they have received reimbursement from FEMA for double pay, you know, in the past emergencies. So that's why I'm not feeling like very comfortable with that we have the facts in front of us, Mr. Chair. Thank you.
Mr. Chair, if I may, just
Yes,
point.
I was going to call you, Madam Speaker.
Thank you.
Go
On the introduction of the bill, on first page, line 6, the hours or the dates would be included for payment would be May 20th, 2021 through May 10th, which was the period of P Core 1.
Okay, March 20, yeah, all right. I see that now. Thank you. So this is CTO retroactive, yeah.
Madam Speaker, is that correct, what Senator Reese brought up? It's CTO retroactive, ma'am? If you can go ahead, there you go.
You got, well, I noted, sir, that the period time would only be allowed for during P Core 1, and that date would be retro to, because it's May already, March 21st, 2020 through May 10th, 2020. That, if we go back to, if there's a resurgence, we had to do it, then we would have to do it all over again.
All right, thank you. Senator Reese, did that answer your question, ma'am?
Yes, yes.
All right, thank you. I would ask now Senator Peter Terlai, Jose, would you have any comments or questions you want to pose to Mr. Longuero or to your co-sponsor of the bill?
No question, Mr. Chairman, but I do want to share some of my thoughts regarding the 359 bill. You know, our island and the whole world are faced with a global pandemic, Mr. Chair, the likes of which we haven't seen in nearly a century. And over 100,000 people have died in the United States alone, more than what we have lost during the Vietnam War. And yet, despite these historic challenges, we have to recognize that, you know, thanks to our frontliners like our nurses and doctors and police officers, we have one of the lowest mortality rate in the United States and have preserved through the storm, like we have generations to generations. And of course, as leaders, we want to reward our frontliners for their hard work and sacrifices they made to protect our residents from this deadly virus, but we are faced with a dilemma. The Attorney General's legal reading of our existing rules and regulations says that double pay is not permissible under the current regulations. And at the same time, the pandemic has created a clear cash crisis in this time of economic uncertainty, one that may compound our ability for all our families to bounce back. We now have several competing bills that try to address this dilemma in various ways. The compromise we came up with allows the employees to accrue up to an hour of annual leave for each hour that they work for. And it is capped at 240 hours so that the financial impact would be kept at a level that was affordable for the administration and still have a frontliners a significant reward to recognize their commitment. And we agree to compromise, and that three parties agreed to the measures, but others decided that they wanted to do things another way. And since then, Tom Fisher and the union have advanced their lawsuit, and here we are, Mr. Chair. We must face our realities of the regulations and our economic situation despite the politics. The time for rhetoric is over, and the time to be reasonable is now, and we need to reward our employees, but we also need to be responsible. And as we go through this hearing and I address this bill in this session, and I just want all my colleagues to have a whole of what I just mentioned, that this, I don't think the CARES Act would support something like this, in as far as, compensating under the CARES Act, the double pay. So that's all that I want to say, Mr. Chair, and hopefully we can get through this and we can all come into one conclusive alternative to really come out with the right idea of what we need to do to compensate our first liners. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Pido. We'll now move to make sure that nobody showed up extra, but moving on to Minority Leader Senator Tello Taitui. Ma'am, you're there. You're on now. Thank you.
Just mostly, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Ken, for coming and testifying. And like always, you're trying to be financially sound and ensuring that we don't give away the store, right? But that being said, Mr. Chair, I was wondering if we had the GFT's testimony. I didn't see it in the documents that was forwarded to us. If we had any kind of testimony from GFT, I know that they have backed out at last minute after first supporting this bill and then later on changing their mind on it. But Mr. Chair, this bill 359, it also begs the question, if this bill should pass, does that mean that it eliminates DOA's personal rules and regulations? Will it do that? Should it become law? That's something we have to think about too, because now we're implementing this kind of law. Does it now replace, 8.406? Again, there's a lot of questions that need to be answered. Unfortunately, we don't have the administration here, but I had the opportunity, Mr. Chair, to listen to the governor's press conference this afternoon. And a question was proffered to her regarding if the money could be used, the CARES money can be used for the double pay. And even the governor could not answer that. In fact, she said that she has Madeline Berdallo in DC looking into it for us. So I'm very curious to see what those results will be with regards to how we can use this CARES Act for something like this. And as we did pass a bill that the governor did veto earlier, there was a section that talked about the private sector. And when we took that out of the bill, there was no objections. I think the biggest concern was that we didn't have the input of the private sector to put their 2 cents into this. I mean, forcing them to pay their employees double pay or even hazard pay or any kind of additional pay for those individuals, we should have the input of the private sector to let us know, unless we'll be happy to give them some of the CARES Act to pay their employees. I'm pretty sure they'll come and support this bill if we have money to give to the private companies for that kind of payment out. But and this is the arena to do so. What we're doing right now and discussing these bills. So, Mr. Chair, I hope that we can get those answers soon by former Congressman Madeline Berdallo on how we can use this funding, and looking forward to also GFT's testimony, as well as being very vigilant on what's happening at the court. Again, thank you, Mr. Chair, for the opportunity.
Thank you, Minority Leader Senator Taro. Senator Muña, ma'am, do you have anything you would like to ask Mr. Longuero or of any of the sponsor or the co-sponsors?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I don't have any questions for Mr. Leon Guerrero. Just thank you again for your testimony. But again, there are just so many questions. Although 359 is the most fiscally responsible or the least amount on all these bills here, I think there's still so many other questions about the specifics of every single one of these bills that can be directed to some of our agencies like DOA and BBMR. And I was hoping that they would be here at least for this one. I mean, can't say 3 strikes and they're out because we still have one more chance, and hopefully that they'll be here for the 6 p.m. So again, I still want to direct some of my questions for not just this bill, but the 2 previous bills that we had heard, and they're not here. And since Senator Moylan's car is small, I can assist in the Uber if they need some help too as well. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Senator Ruiz. Senator Moylan, Mr. Uber, sir, do you have any question of Mr. Longuero or any of the sponsors or sir?
Just a thank you to Mr. Leon Guerrero, and I'll wait for the last debate on the final bill that we'll hear next. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Thank you. Senator Will Castro, do you have any questions, sir?
Just a general statement, Mr. Chair. Of course, as a co-sponsor, I support the measure, but I want to let my colleagues know who are all here that, I remain open to amendments that'll serve to improve the bill as it's currently written. And I also want to say for the record that I'm not shy to admit that the record will reflect that it was I who stood up for the record as well for non-healthcare professionals to be included, those who are at ground zero. I personally went and saw people who are not classified, people that you wouldn't characterize as law enforcement, folks who are definitely not first responders or healthcare professionals. But notwithstanding that that measure failed, although the amendment was included and that measure failed ultimately, I was willing to sign my name to this bill in good faith that we can have this conversation openly, transparently, and on the floor with other subject matter experts, folks from both the executive branch and in light with new information that I believe the good speaker is going to make available that frankly I'm not aware of just yet. Also, I hope that we can get some kind of a position from the Attorney General and or the courts on the matter. You see, it is my position too, Mr. Chairman and Madam Speaker, that each of the bills, to include Senator Nelson's and yours, Mr. Chairman, all have merit, and I'm willing to hear them all equally so that we can come together. It's a complex issue. The previous speaker mentioned, the only gentleman here provided testimony outside of the Senate. It's controversial, it's divisive, but I like to look at it from the perspective of Mayor Pito Terlahi when he basically said we need to come together and be reasonable and responsible in our deliberations. And so with that said, Mr. Chairman, I want to thank you, Madam Speaker, and the other colleagues who gave me the privilege to assign my name to this bill so that we can attempt to cure some of the issues. Granted not all the issues, and most especially not in 359 as written, but at least we can come together and debate on the floor when it's ready for our final disposition. But with that said, Mr. Chairman, again, I can only encourage you then to have them prepared at the Committee of the Whole so that we can have the facts in front of us, so that we can ask questions about each of the measures, even though they didn't make it perhaps to the regular session. I'd like to know what the financial impact would be, all things considered, with all of the measures, because that could inform our position on the amendments that may be made to 359 should it be advanced to the full body. So, Mr. Chairman, again, we're flying in the dark. If we don't have subject matter experts from DOA, BBMR, and any other person who can help inform the people of Guam through the House of the People, the Guam legislature, on this complex issue. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Will. Senator Mary Torres, ma'am, do you have anything you'd like to say? You're one of the co-sponsors.
Yes, as a matter of fact, Mr. Chairman, I am one of the co-sponsors. And I think at the time that I agreed to co-sponsor, we didn't have competing bills that were introduced, and there was no indication that they would come down, 357, 358, and 361. At the time that I agreed to co-sponsor, there was a feeling that there was a need to calm the waters, that there was an uproar about double pay and people being entitled to. And with the representations of the governor's office as this being a good compromise, with the Guam Federation of Teachers representative indicating that this was a good compromise, of course I came on board with the notion that there was a need to calm the waters and to pacify people who we rely on to go to work. There's always an incentive that is needed to keep people at their utmost performance and on duty. However, with the introduction of 357, 358, 361, and the lawsuits, the writ that was filed and I believe heard today, and then another lawsuit filed in district court with regard to double pay, I believe that we've got a lot of trouble brewing, and that this bill isn't in my estimate now, not ripe for discussion. What concerns me the most is we now know, and we had contemplated whether the CARES funds would be a remedy. We now know that most likely it would not be a remedy to fund the cost of implementing Bill 359 or the other bills that are up for discussion. Secondly, should the court award an order that the government of Guam complete its fiduciary duty to pay double pay, then we now have a potential scenario, and I'm speculating, that you have both compensatory leave awards plus double pay awards. There's really no distinction that one will be given and the other not, or one will be given in lieu of the other. So that's my foremost concern. Are we doubling up on something that is already without federal funding, way out of the league? And then the second point I want to make is, even if we were to go through with this bill, you've set a precedent now for all other scenarios going forward. In the event that you do not have federal funding, we know that in situations like this, where your economy is stalled for 3 months, you know that we don't have revenues coming in. There is a huge job loss on Guam. Small businesses are limping and relying on grant monies from the federal agencies and other sorts of short-term bridge loans to keep them afloat. This is not the time to be so generous. And I'm not saying that we're cheating people out. I'm just saying that when you've got a situation that was pointed out by Holly Resnick this morning, and I believe Mr. Leon-Guerrero, you've also alluded to this, the disproportionate number of private sector employees to GovGuam employees it's a huge imbalance and a huge advantage to a small section, perhaps 20% of our employed on Guam. I feel that the best remedy right now with 359 is to just hold on to it. I think that given the fact that we've got so many considerations with revenues and how to keep this government open so that we can provide essential services, now is not the time. Senator Pito Terlahi alluded to it in some ways. When things are really, really bad, you toe the line. And I think that, or you cut back. And I think that in the situation of 359, originally, it was the idea of how do we minimize the burden, assuming that there was an obligation, right? How do you minimize that? But now we don't even know what that obligation is with the court suits that have been filed. So without knowing that implication, what that would, the ruling on that, how it would affect 359 if 359 were to pass, and the writ is granted and they are ordered to pay, what would that implication be to the government? At the very least, we know we can't afford perhaps one, and certainly not both, one or the other or both. But the situations really with the way that all the bills were introduced, I think really should give us a lot of pause to proceed with extreme caution, because we are talking about a government that is relying on federal monies, number one. So we're not in a good position. Number two, we know that a great majority of our population is out of work right now and struggling. So the idea that you're going to more than generously compensate a few without consideration or even sympathy for the others that are left out of the loop, not by their choice, but just by their circumstances, I think is really egregious. I'm feeling that. And I say that from the perspective of a person who has within my own family those sort of employees that have had to work every single day of this pandemic, not necessarily as frontliners, but as private employees, private sector employees. So as a policymaker, the balance really is, how do we take care of our community? How do we not place greater value on one over the other? How do I, as a senator, look at my private sector nurse family member and say, well, your value as a frontline hero is not worth as much as the frontline hero who works for the government of Guam? That's what we're talking about. And I think, Mr. Leon-Guerrero, that's what you're talking about, if I'm not mistaken. It's how do you bring not only equity, but a sense that we're all in this together. That's the tagline for this pandemic. We're all in this together. And quite frankly, it's the most unfair pandemic that anyone could conceive of. It doesn't discriminate. It affects us all in some way or another, some more than others. But generally, how do we just mitigate things so that everybody can get out of this in some good shape? Just get out of it, not necessarily make windfall out of it, because none of us are ever going to be compensated really for what we deserve that we suffered. And many of us have suffered. I've seen professionals that have, there's almost a level playing field right now where people who were very secure executives are now out of jobs. Did they deserve it? No. But, you know, my point is, I struggle also with the definition of a hero, and it's true. I find it very hard to put the value, more value on one individual over another, because in the grand scheme of things, everyone is critical. Every person matters. Every person matters. Even the person that has nothing to contribute but is a law-abiding citizen. Their value is just as important to me as any other hero that you might, you know, give a shiny badge to. So I just want to leave that. I think as a co-sponsor, I don't regret co-sponsoring the bill. I think at the time, given the circumstances and given the you know, what the different players were bringing to the table, I felt that it was a good way to calm the waters. But I think right now, with 357, 358, 361 in play, plus the lawsuits, there's a lot to think about. And I don't think that they could all coexist, or that any of them should actually pass at this point. Suzus Maasi.
Thank you, Senator Mary. I think I've asked every one of my colleagues to speak, so now it'll be my turn to speak. Number one, my colleagues, as you look at the fiscal note, keep in mind, it never identifies CARES funding. So you don't need to ask that question because it doesn't say that. Basically, it's all stating that it's basically going to come from the general fund. But if you take a look at this bill, the bill has good intention, but we got to keep in mind that after you split 240 and you say, and it states here $4.5 million, it's still another form of double pay. And it doesn't matter how you want to look at it. It's just saying we're going to pay a little bit today and we'll pay the rest tomorrow. But in the minds of management and financial management, that other half that you're paying is not to be paid tomorrow, but be paid in the long run. So in other words, as the employee increases his salary or wants to cash out, it becomes an additional 4.5 that the government must inherit in the future. And as they grow in increments and so forth, it just gets more expensive. So to me, looking at the bill has good intention, but it's still another way of a double pay, except it's split in half. That's really what it is. It's a half double pay, because 50%. Go ahead, Senator Therese. I'm speaking, but go ahead.
When you're done, I just want to follow up on what you're saying, Mr. Chair. So are you saying that you calculate this to be more of an impact because if it's paid later, the impact will be higher? I had not heard that before. That's a good idea.
Well, Senator Therese, if you take a look at it, if you had $1 today and I had $1 today, I gave you 50 cents. You know, and it's true. It's all financial management. And this is what I've expressed. But like I said, the bill has good intention, and I just see it as we're going to delay paying the other half later. Okay. Now moving along on that one, I'm going to ask Madam Speaker to stand by because you're going to do your closing, Senator. Mr. Ken Leonguero, and that's pretty much all I wanted to ask on this or make a statement about this bill. Like I said, the bill has good intention. Don't get me wrong. I'm just concerned about the financial part, and the fiscal note does state there is no CARES. So that's not a debatable part. There's no CARES. This is all out of the general fund. I honestly believe that the CARES money should go to the people of Guam so they can take care of everybody. It shouldn't be an issue of everything is all Gov Guam and the people, the frontliners in the private industry are not getting any share. It's all, you want to borrow, we'll give you some to borrow. No. We need to share this. That's what the intent is for. Mr. Ken, did you want to say anything further before I ask the author of the bill to make her closing on this bill?
Yes, I do. When we're looking at the front line, we have to realize that there are two front lines. There's the government front line and there is the private front line. The government front line is a small number, a couple thousand employees based on the numbers I've heard so far. The private sector front line is probably somewhere around 8 to 10,000 employees. The government front line has had to handle somewhere between 2,000 and 4,000 interactions with risk. When you count the testing, you count the quarantine, and you count the actual cases. The private front line is dealing with 20 to 30,000 people a day in the grocery stores, the supermarkets, the gas stations, the restaurants, the electrical contractors, the plumbing contractors. There was a large segment of the service community that was vital. Non-government doctors, chiropractors, dentists, and they were all taking the same risk as the government frontliners. So this is another divisive point here. We're going to take a couple thousand people and treat them differently than the 10 or 12,000 people that were taking maybe even more risk, because look at it. I mean, how many testings did we do over the past 2.5 months? I heard a number saying somewhere between 3,500 and 4,000. Look at how many people go through the grocery stores every day. How many people went through the gas stations? How many people went to restaurants and takeout? So both frontliners were providing extremely important and essential services to this community. And I think that if you're going to divide out and say these frontliners, going back to Senator Torres's comment, these frontliners are worth more than these frontliners, it falls right into Rule 7 from Animal House, which is all animals are created equal, but some animals are created more equal than others. So now we're saying that some employees who took risk, government, are worth more than the employees who took the same level of risk and took it more often, aren't worth as much. And that is going to have serious ramifications for this community moving forward. The whole goal of this CARES Act was to help restore the community, help revive businesses, and bring our economy back to its former level. We're not going to get there overnight, but we have to look at everybody and treat everybody the same. If you were in dancing distance of another person who is a potential COVID-19 carrier, I mean, look at asymptomatic for how many days, who had the most exposure? Grocery clerks, maybe, food service clerks. So we need to treat everybody that's taken the same risk. We need to treat them exactly the same, whether we are government or non-government, because they both share the same risk.
All right, thank you, Mr. Leon. All right, thank you. Madam Speaker, would you like to make your closing statement on your bill, please?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair, for making me close. And more importantly, thank you to my colleagues for staying on for this public hearing. To Mr. Leon Guerrero, thank you for your input. Mr. Chair, if I may, I just want to note for the record that I personally believe that $1 today, based on our financial cash shortage, is probably worth more than $5 to $10 in 10 years. I want to share with you with this intent and getting a bipartisan support for this bill, that it was important to realize, as we shared and listened to the concerns of our frontliners and what we could do to look and manage what cash we had today, and something that we had hoped that the administration would support as it relates to paying our frontliners, that this was an idea and a concerted effort of making sure that everybody came to that same table with those concerned. The goal was to pay and get that resources to our frontliners right away because they weren't getting it. And again, it was an idea. It was being creative. It was stepping outside of the box. It was literally trying to manage the cash that we had today. And how do we get the administration to engage to find what they have today to pay out? So this was that creative idea. And again, it's an opportunity to work on and move forward depending on what comes our way with added information that we will be receiving. But again, I want to thank everybody for being here, and I hope that as we look at all the bills that are presented before us, that we can come up with some amicable solution to help all our frontliners. So thank you, Mr. Chair, and just thank you for having heard all the bills and giving priority to all the bills to be heard through the public hearing process. Sign them
Yes, and thank you, Madam Speaker. There being no additional individuals to present further testimony on this bill, the committee will continue to keep this record open for several days to accept any additional information on public testimony on the agenda that we have just discussed. You may submit testimony to the mailroom of the Guam Legislature in the Guam Congress Building or through email at Senator Joe S. Augustin at gmail.com. I want to thank everyone for their participation in these proceedings. The public hearing is now adjourned. The time is now 5:16. And Sidus Masi, the next bill that we heard would be at 6 o'clock, would be Bill 361. So for the folks at home and my colleagues, if you want to join, please check your email and we will be sending out the link. And if anybody else wants to join this evening, please send an email to my office, Senator Joe S. Augustin at gmail.com, and we will respond. And please send it now. Thank you. Have a nice day.